We are live. We are live. Finally, I was waiting for a couple of people to join on. Yeah, but we are live now. It is 31 minutes past midnight UK time. 31 minutes past 7 Eastern Standard Time, and that is the prime time to stream. If you're in the UK, trying to get an Eastern Standard Time audience, you know, I'm waffling. I'm talking shite. Yeah, you know, let's just get into this. This is an idea that came up with a month or two ago. I thought, why not, rather than doing the standard? Oh, by the way, Orc, what's up, man? Orc was in the stream. Elbow cough. Yeah, yeah, I agree. um, hopefully, people will be jumping on going forward because I don't want to be talking to myself all fucking night. But yeah, this is a. Why am I so fucking shiny and bright? This fucking. I've got to be able to do some of this fucking. Is that better? I'm just trying to adjust the light a little bit. That's better. A little bit. So I came up with an idea a few weeks ago about, because most of my live streams on a Tuesday night usually revolve around like covering stories going on in the world of horror and other issues, mainly connected to like movie industry. And I just thought, try and do something a little bit different, because I've done a few like tier lists and stuff and countdowns of like best slasher films of the 80s and shit like that. But I thought, why not just like take a specific year, usually, yeah, primarily linked to like growing up, especially because I mean, the year tonight would be 1988. Um, and I think most, I'll probably do this on like on a monthly basis. So kind of maybe, I think this may be the earliest I go in terms of years, because 88 is kind of like the beginning of like me becoming, when the boy becomes a man almost, because 88 was the year that I turned 12. Okay, not 13. I suppose that's when you say you become a man. But yeah, so I turned 12 in 88, and that's the year I started high school. So 88 is kind of the year where I kind of got introduced to like new stuff, because when you're a kid and you're like, you're in, I don't know what you call it in America. Like in the UK, it was junior school. So you're in that school up until like the age of 11, 10 or 11, and then you progress to high school. And that's what I did in 88. So 1988 is kind of the year that I kind of got exposed to like stuff that, you meet new people, meet new friends, and they're into different stuff, and you just get exposed to like new stuff. And 88 was kind of an important year for me in terms of like what I got introduced to, music, um, video games, and movies, shit like that. So I just thought it's a good year to start off with. 88 was a good year to start off with. Um, and obviously, going forward, I'll probably taking everything up until the late 90s, probably. Maybe up until about 96, 97. Yeah, probably cover a good 8 or 9 years, because they're the years that resonate with me. 88, starting high school, going right through to the mid to late 90s, where I kind of like came of age and became an adult. But obviously, a lot of important stuff happens during your late teens and early 20s. So even though you're kind of like an adult at that point, you still kind of feel like a kid in a way, especially when you're like 19, 20. Legally, they say you're an adult, but mentally, you still feel like a kid in many ways. So, yeah, I think that, like, I'm going to cover like an area that means something growing up, I think from like 12 to sort of like 20, 21 kind of makes sense. I think anything before 12, like going back to like the mid 80s, it's kind of a bit of a blur. It doesn't really make much. I can't remember that much about it. And in terms of pop culture, I wasn't consuming pop culture as we would call it at that time. You know, it was just kind of, well, it was in a way, but it was very sort of like it was very contained into what, you know, I wasn't venturing out and going video stores, and you know, in terms of video games, I was basically playing what was bought for me. We didn't really have any say in what, you know, my dad would just buy video games he thought I'd like to play. TV shows were pretty irrelevant at the time. For someone my age, I wasn't really paying much attention. But most importantly, movies, definitely movies. You know, it was getting to just like 11, 12, 13, at that age when you start venturing out on your own and going to video stores and just marveling at the sort of the poster art on the walls and like questioning what was that, what's that. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I'll get into that further down the line anyway. But in terms of 1988, you know, I have kind of tried to sort of set this out in a practical way where I can do a proper live stream and not just get completely lost for words. But I mean, I've basically given an explanation of what this is about. You know, the stream is about, and as I say, yeah, it's 1988 is an important year for me personally, and I think 1988 is probably a year that means a lot for a lot of people, probably who kind of you know, go about our kind of community, you know, because whether you and not an adult, maybe I don't think anybody who we kind of communicate with in this community was an adult in '88. I don't think anybody's that old, Jesus. But in terms of like, you know, being a teenager or being a, you know, an adolescent, or even if you just a baby or you're even born, I think everybody can appreciate that 1988 was kind of like an important year um, in terms of pop culture and horror and all that went on at the time. Because whether you live through it or you just live through it vicariously, you know, through, you know, watching old YouTube videos or whatnot, it means something to a lot of people. And I guess that's why I chose 88 as the first year to choose from. I mean, um, so what I thought I would do is I thought I'd break down what I was going to do in terms of like going forward is take each year and break it down into films with a few memories about the time, video games with a few memories about that, and music as well, and maybe even throw in a few TV shows. But in terms of the films from '88, you know, um, Darren's in the chat. What's up, man? Darren, I know you're of a similar vintage to me, so you probably really be able to like sort of get on board with what I'm going to say regarding movies and films and TV shows. Hi, Mike. 1988. I was on the YTS scheme working for Facebook. Yes, I remember the YTS scheme well. That was a bit before my time, but I do remember the YTS scheme in the UK. I remember, yeah, um, watching Brookside. That was something that was brought up regularly on that soap opera. But you'll probably really resonate with some of the stuff I'm going to say now, anyway. So before I get into like, you know, talking about 1988 and the films that came out the year, I think it's important to like sort of relate to go back into what it was like in 1988. Anybody who is of a certain age knows what I'm talking about, but it's nice to reminisce, and I think you'll appreciate, just anybody going back to that point and just talking about it, and it'll bring back a few nostalgic memories. And anybody who was born after the 80s, it's probably lost on them, because this is something that died out in the late 90s, early 2000s. But just the video store, the video store. I want to see the video store. I'm talking about video store in terms of written out video tapes, VHS tapes. So 1988, I was 12, 11 going on 12. And yeah, I mean, started high school, senior school. If you're in the UK, high school is more of an American thing, but we called it senior school. But starting senior school in 1988, and just being introduced to like new friends who were like way more on board with like the horror scene. I mean, I'm going to reference the horror scene specifically because it was more the kids I sort of got friends with were like already, even though they were the same age as me, their parents probably just didn't give a shit what they watched. So they were probably watching like horror films from like the age of 5 or something. But I wasn't, I was quite protected as a kid. My mum and dad were like, oh, you can't watch that, that's too violent. And they were like that until I was like 14. But, meeting new friends, I specifically, a couple of new friends starting senior school as a 12-year-old, and their mum she didn't care what they watched. So that was kind of like the beginning of like really getting introduced into like the slasher genre. And although obviously before that I'd gone to the video rental store as a kid, a year or two before that, I just walking into a video rental store in the late 80s, which was not a Blockbuster, which was not like a chain video store. It was just like a great experience. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was great walking into a Blockbusters in the 90s because you were still young, and whether you're young or not, it was a great feeling walking into a video store. But the smell, it had the specific smell, like a Blockbusters especially had the smell of like, it's hard to describe. The fact that I had like carpet, it just smelled of carpet and like, cleanliness, which is like complete opposite of what I was used to walking into the video stores I used to walk into before Blockbuster came along. But going back, because Blockbuster is a 90s thing, I'm going back to the 80s, going back to 88. Yeah, so the video store, my local video store, you'd walk in and there'd be 3 aisles. I think I've described this in a previous stream, but I'm going to go through it again anyway. 3 aisles, middle aisle, new releases, right aisle, older stuff, and video games. I'm talking like old school tape. This is more of a UK thing. So in the UK, like we didn't really have Nintendo back in them days, or like Sega. Zaxxas and just focus. And yeah, I am. Yes, you might see my thumbnail, Zach. I will get to Zach. I will get to the music at some point. Yeah, because I do mention "And Justice for All" in the thumbnail. But yeah, I will get to that. Yeah, you're right. But going back to just walking into a video store, and Anthony's on board now. Oh, Anthony, I miss renting VHS. My looking at the video store. Good when it closed down. Yeah, absolutely, man. It's a crying shame. It's something that I think this resonates particularly with us in the UK. I think we all remember, like, I suppose Americans did. This is probably because I can't connect. I mean, I like to connect with Americans on a lot of levels, but because I've never I can't transformed myself to the US in the late 80s. So I honestly don't know exactly what it was like for you guys. I can only relate what it was like in the UK. And I know that like I'll see Anthony and Darren, and as Sean jumps on, I know he's Irish, but it's the same thing. You know, and because you're a similar age to me, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about, you know, going to a VHS store in the late 80s or early 90s. Darren says, Sakai, someone on the tour, as someone saw 2 years earlier. Yeah, I mean, that I will get on to Metallica a little bit further down the line, but just keep on. I'm just going to try and keep on film thing for now, and then move on to movies and the video games, and then come back to movies probably. But just trying to keep on a movie thing. Just going back to my local video store, you know, you walked in, and my video store was like at the bottom of my road. It was like, because you know, from Liverpool, so it was a fairly big city, decent sized city. So, you know, there was no shortage of video stores. I had one at the bottom of my road. I had one at the top of my road a couple of years later. But the one that really sort of resonates with me is it's called the Firebase Video Centre, which it opened up very early on in the VHS era, like maybe 83, 82. And I started really going there a lot in about 87, right through to like the early 90s. Oh, Jamie's in the chat. What's up, Jamie? I was 15 in 88, jean jackets, torn jeans, concerts. I was in 80s Malky, and I could just see you, Jamie. I could just see you as like you know, I could see you in Stranger Things. I could just see you there as, you know, one of the mall girls, you know, with the long red hair, just, you know, sat in the corner like smoking a cigarette and chewing gum. I could just see you. I could think that'd be that you down to a T. But it's good to see you on board, Jamie. So yeah. Anyway, so I'll get around to. I'm trying to finish this story, but you know, I'll just keep on getting distracted by the chat, which is a good thing. Don't get me wrong; it's a good thing. But yeah, you'd walk in, new releases front and center, right hand side, video games. But I'm talking like tapes, you know, like Commodore 64, Amstrad, Spectrum, Anthony and Darren know what I'm talking about. And on the left hand side, in the sort of like darkened corner of the video store, would be like the horror releases. The older horror films, the new horror films would be front and center. And then as you go in on the left, you'd have all the old horror films, and then the top shelf, it's all the blueies, all the porn films. So as a kid, you kind of like walking in, and you're looking at the horror films, you know, you're looking at the Halloween 2s, the Halloweens, you know, the Evil Deads and all, you know, all the horror films, the older horror films. But at the same time, you're kind of looking up, and you want to look at, you know, you're trying to have a little quick grab at, like, you know, the porn films. And yeah, that innocent days. Jamie says the kids in Strange Things are the exact age I was time apart. Yeah, you're right there, Jamie. Actually, yeah, because you're a little bit older than me. The kids in It Chapter 2 are totally in line with me, because they were 13 in 89, which is what I was. So when watching It Chapter 2, it's kind of like totally resonates. How many times am I going to say the word resonates tonight? But I totally relate to It Chapter 2, because they're 13 and 89, which is what I was. And I get what you say about Stranger Things. Yeah, they probably completely tie up with you personally as well. Darren says, in 1988, we had a shop that also rented out videos. The owner was a family friend, so from the early 80s, everything. They even had the extras Valentine. Yeah, there was always like a video store where, you know, somebody was like just had under the counter films which you couldn't see anywhere else. And I think that's probably a staple of anywhere in England, or probably America as well. But moving on, that was kind of like my experience of like renting out. It sounds like renting out movies back in the late 80s. But just going on to some of the films of 88, I mean, I wouldn't say 88 was a vintage year for movies. I did like a bit of a rundown. I've tried to stick to some of the more mainstream stuff. I didn't want to go too obscure because I've tried to really focus on films that meant something to me at the time. And not every film I mention now is a film that I watched at the time. Some of the films I did watch later on, but I've tried to like focus on films that I particularly remember. Just I might not have even seen at that time. It may have been a film I just remember for the artwork and didn't see for years later. And certainly a film that well, I think if I can share the screen now. This is a film that I didn't see for like about 10 years later, but I will share it because it's just a film that really, really. I'm not doing this right at all. Hang on, let me get my Chrome tab. That's it. Yeah, Maniac Cup. Maniac Cup is a film I didn't see for a good 10 years after release, but this cover art here, I think this was the cover art when I was growing up, but man, when I saw this, I was desperate to see this film. Absolutely desperate to see this film. I thought this looks like the greatest film of all time. This is me as an 11-year-old, 12-year-old, and I never actually got around to seeing it until about 1998. But and yeah, I was slightly disappointed afterwards. And it's not a bad film, but it's not the greatest film of all time. But when you're a kid and you see cover art like that, you just think, I need to see this film. I need to see this film. But yeah, Maniac Cop is definitely a film that growing up, I was just like fascinated by. And it says something about movies from the late 80s where they really needed to rely on artwork to sell the product, because before the internet, you couldn't rely. You couldn't go on IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes and see what's the average score of this film. You're basing it on newspaper reviews, which kids my age didn't read newspapers. We just went to the video store. We thought, fucking hell, there's a cop there with a severed head, or he's got like a deformed face. I'm fucking watching that shit. I don't give a fuck. So that's where the glorious 80s artwork comes from, and we're never going to see that era again because there's not any real need now to sell a film on artwork because people just basically go online and find out whether the film is decent through a review on YouTube or IMDb. Which, okay, it saves you time. It saves you the evidence of watching a bad film, but I would say, come on. I mean, I'm prepared to risk watching a bad film just for glorious artwork. James says, my high school boyfriend's parents owned a small video store. We watched everything literally. I can imagine. Is that literally as in they had porn as well? Sorry, I don't want to get too down and dirty, but I just, the VHS store I used to go to had everything. And when you say everything, that included, porn as well. So, Steak's in the chat. What's up, man? What's up, Steak? Dan says, Maniac Cup, never seen the Iron State. He's never seen it, but he owns a steelbook. Yeah, you should definitely check it out if you own it, Dan. Definitely should check it out. It's a fun film. It's not like the greatest film of all time, but what else in '88? That was just like I'll just do. That was kind of something. There was a back room, lol. Yeah, I'm sure there was. In terms of like the 80s, in terms of 88, I mean, as I say, it wasn't a golden year, but some of the films that did stand out for me, as they resonate with me, in the long term. I mean, certainly The Blob, which is a film that came out in '88. Now, this is a film that I didn't see in '88, but I did see maybe 2 years later at the most. That is just, I just love that. I love The Blob. It's such a great film. It's such a, I mean, it reminds me of those. I mean, obviously, it's a remake of the '50s sort of creature features, but the '80s for me, like when I, and this is probably not going to make much sense to somebody in the UK. I mean, maybe it will, but it may not even make much sense to you guys in the US. But watching some of these like late '80s or mid '80s US horror films set in these like idyllic small towns, it kind of like harkens back to like this idea of the late '50s in the US. Um, you know, the way it was in '58 and the Blob was in '58, and just this innocent. There's like it's hard to describe. I mean, some of these American films that came out in the mid to late '80s, which is set in these small towns, it kind of envisions like a naivety, like an innocence to them, which kind of goes back to the '50s, which I kind of really relate to. But I don't relate to. I'd like to relate to, I should say, because it's just totally away from what I grew up experiencing. You know, I would have loved to have grown up in a small American town in in the mid to late '80s or the mid to late '50s, maybe, but instead growing up in like in like a fairly big city, which is just grey and grimy and just a bit depressing. Which is not, it wasn't a bad upbringing, but it just anybody who's seen anything from the UK in the mid to late '80s, it just looks so grey and just grim and depressing. And when us guys were watching stuff that you guys were making in the mid to late '80s, it just seems so like colourful and nice, and you know, obviously not talking about like fucking Candyman. I'm just talking about, you know, stuff that, you know, was made, you know, out of the main cities and in you know, in these nice little suburban towns. But I just love that like era of like late '80s America in small towns, like the Blob. I just it's just something I just would love to experience growing up. Um, Return of the Living Dead Part 2, another '88 movie, which, I mean, I'm not the biggest Return of the Living Dead fan. I know Christian's a massive fan. Not for me. I mean, I'm not a big fan of the first film either. I mean, I know some people would call that sacrilege, but it's just not for me. And yeah, I've never really seen the appeal of any of those films. I'm not like I'm not. It's not like I'm not a fan of, you know, the sort of zombie genre, but it's just I've never really got it. It's just completely, yeah. Sleepaway Camp 2, this film. I mean, Sleepaway Camp 1 is obviously, you know, a kind of like cult classic. For me, 2 was always meant more to me because this is just going right back to me being a kid. This is a film that I saw not long after release in, you know, best friend's house at school, who was obviously the kid who was allowed to watch anything he wanted, you know, regardless of whether it was blood, guts, sex, whatever. And let's face it, Sleepaway Camp 2 had all of those things combined. But yeah, Sleepaway Camp 2 is just one of those movies that it's sleazy, it's gory. You know, they kill kids in that film. You know, they kill like fairly young kids. But yeah, watching this film back in the day, you know, like literally watching it as a 12-year-old or maybe I must have been 13 at this point, with two best mates and their mum, who was like quite religious, but didn't seem to have any problem with them watching horror films with lots of sex in. And Sleepaway Camp 2 has got like two like quite graphic sex scenes. And watching those films like as a kid, just, I mean, as a 12, and you can imagine what it's like as a 12-year-old going on 13, watching a film like that, it's pretty awkward. There's a lot of cushions are kind of well positioned for certain scenes in a film, if you know what I mean. I'm sure Darren does. Yeah, Sleepaway Camp 2, that poster. Yeah, Darren, quick question. When I was a kid growing up, before we saw that film, obviously this is way before the internet, so there was like an urban, not an urban legend, it's not the right word. The rumor was that Freddy and Jason were in that film because obviously she had the Freddy glove and the hockey mask. So somebody in my school just started a rumor that, oh, you need to see Nightmare Vacation. It was called Nightmare Vacation 2 in the UK, from what I remember. But Sleepaway Camp 2 in America. But some kid in school said, oh, you need to see this film. Freddy and Jason are in this film. So we were all like, what? Freddy and Jason are in this film? Fuck me, we need to see this film. So, we got the film, rented it out, watched it. Yeah, there's no sign of it. Just a big fat lie. But that's Chinese whispers in the 80s could go around an entire school. And there's no fucking phone, there's no smartphone, no internet to just double check and go, no, you're talking shit. So until somebody saw the film, yeah, we all believed it. Yeah, it's just crazy, man. It's just the rumors you could start before the internet. I mean, man, you could just you could do anything. More film from '88, a film that like I loved and yet never ever delved further into in terms of a genre. I loved Akira. Obviously manga, anime. Loved that film and never really gave the entire genre much of a chance after that, which is crazy because that was kind of like the ground zero for like anime, and I really liked it. And yet, for some reason, never even like ventured back to check it out. It's just weird. I don't know why I've never done that. Maybe, maybe I should really should look into it, but I don't know. Like I just it is what it is. I just never ever like sort of went back to it, even though I loved the film. Um, Bloodsport with Jean-Claude Van Damme. This was the beginning of, for me, of the rebirth of like martial arts films. I could be wrong. I mean, martial arts was probably a thing in the early 80s, but 88, like Bloodsport, Kickboxer, and then Seagal came on with Nico and then Hard to Kill. Is it just me, or did martial arts films really take off in 88 going forward? American Ninja, Best of the Best. I mean, there was just an endless slew of like martial arts films that seemed to come out between 88 and like 91, 92, maybe a little bit later than that. But oh my God, I was a big fan of those martial arts films back in the day because I'd kind of, like a friend of mine who's like a big Bruce Lee fan, he kind of got me into the Bruce Lee films around the same time. So I was kind of, big Bruce Lee fan in terms of like watching I used to watch Enter the Dragon all the time, Way of the Dragon, and I was kind of like always comparing like these new, Seagal and Van Damme going, oh, they're not as good as Bruce Lee. I was trying to be the cool kid, like kids in my school going, oh, isn't they were like saying, oh, Jean-Claude Van Damme would beat Steven Seagal. Steven Seagal would beat, who was there was another fucking guy as well, Dolph Lundgren, even though he wasn't a martial artist. And I'd be like that, go, no, Bruce Lee would beat them all. And they're like, Bruce Lee, who's Bruce Lee? I'm like, oh, you don't know who Bruce Lee is? And I was like, I'm trying to educate them. Like I was the fucking cool kid, and I didn't know shit. I just knew who Bruce Lee was because like my friend who was older than me had got me into it. But it did feel like that martial art films became a thing in the late 80s, around 88. It's something that I think that year could be, like not certainly not a ground zero, but for like the new wave of martial arts films. I think they were definitely doing it before then. But I think Van Damme and Steven Seagal kind of broke new ground and got going forward for the next 5 years or so, because Nico and Bloodsport and Kickboxer were kind of like they were fairly big hits for me. As I remember, me and my friends, we just devoured those films. Now, they may not be massive successes in the cinema, but I think on VHS, I think a lot of people around like the Western world really got on board with those films. James says, all the kids in the neighborhood loved Akira. I ended up seeing it 3 times because I went with my friends, family to drive-in. You ain't cool if you'd seen it a lot. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of one of those films where it was kind of where it was certainly where I was. It was a word of mouth thing. You know, bearing in mind, back in the late 80s, you know, Japanese films were like, we'd never even heard of them. And a Japanese animated film would be like, what? But it did kind of cross boundaries, that film. I remember when the Deadpool, because that film was great. I remember watching Deadpool back in the day, Dan. Yeah. Was Guns N' Roses in that film? Were Guns N' Roses in a scene on like a boat or something? I seem to remember. I was thinking I saw, and it's one of those things now. I'm thinking, is this like the Mandela effect, which I've mentioned a few times, like the Mandela effect, where you think you've seen something and it never happened? And I've watched that film back. Maybe I watched a different version, but I don't remember seeing him in the film. But I can swear to God that there's a scene in Deadpool where Guns N' Roses are in that scene, in a scene on a boat or something, which is a bit weird. But maybe it's just me. Maybe you can clarify that for me. Chuck Norris was. He was churning out films right throughout the 80s. I mean, I don't want to diss Chuck Norris in any way. Chuck Norris, I mean, Silent Rage, what a fucking movie. But I kind of feel like Chuck Norris kind of was, because he was around so long, like martial arts films kind of went off the radar, and Chuck Norris was never sexy, if you know what I mean. He was from the era of the early 70s with Bruce Lee. So even though he was still churning out these martial arts films, like Van Damme and Seagal kind of brought it back and made it sexy again. You know, they were these younger, you know, I wouldn't say fitter. That's probably the wrong word, but they looked more like movie stars. They didn't have the hairy chest and, you know, the beard. And it sounds really disingenuous to Chuck Norris, but it's kind of the way things were back then. It was all about the aesthetics, and you know, Hollywood was Hollywood at that time especially was obsessed with looks. And I think Steven Seagal and Van Damme just ticked the boxes more than Chuck Norris. Even though there's no doubt in my mind, Chuck Norris would just destroy both of them in a fight with both hands tied behind his back. But yeah, I do believe that it was partly down to just, you know, Hollywood jumping on a bandwagon. I've got a few more films to cover, I think. Now I don't really want to. Police Academy 5. Okay, why Police Academy 5? Well, because this is probably the earliest I'm going to go back in terms of doing the years. And Police Academy 5 is 88, and I've got a real love-hate relationship with Police Academy, the Police Academy series, because growing up, you know, and going back to this year in particular, the Police Academy series is something I binge watched relentlessly when I was around 12, 13 years of age. I mean, I just adored the Police Academy series. And it was the Police Academy series was very reminiscent of in terms of consistency of releases. That could be a bot. I'm not quite entirely sure what that means. I don't think that's a genuine subscriber. Jamie says, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Saturday morning cartoons and the Karate Kid. That started the karate craze. My brothers were so my God, I adored Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I loved so much. And yeah, I mean, my God, when the film dropped in 1990, my God, I was so on board with it. I bought the album, on vinyl, the 12-inch vinyl. And I thought I mean, it looks pretty naff now, pretty sad, but I thought that album was so fucking good. I loved the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film, but I won't go into it now because it's a 1990 film, but that film was fucking awesome for me. And he says, I love the Police Academy films on the TV. Yeah, going back to the Police Academy films, because I didn't really get into why I loved them so much, but they were kind of like, in the way the Friday the 13th films kind of like, they epitomised the 80s in terms of horror films. The Police Academy films were the epitome of like 80s comedy, because if you look at the 80s, I think the Police Academy films were released 5 movies in the 80s, maybe even 6. I'm not entirely sure when 6 came out, but like certainly the first 5 films all came out in the 1980s. And it was kind of like, it was nailed on, almost like, you get a Friday the 13th film, you get a Police Academy film. They were kind of like, they were chalk and cheese, but I loved both because for the cheesiness of the Friday the 13th movies, and I'm not disparaging the Friday the 13th. It's my favourite horror franchise, but there was a fair amount of cheese in them. And you could say the same for the Police Academy series. It was cheesy as hell, and I loved them for it. I mean, the first film is it's just a fantastic comedy anyway. Diminishing returns from the following films, but I just like, again, it's like the Friday the 13th franchise. I didn't see the films in the first 5 or 6 years of the release of the films, but 1988, 87, 88, 89, I saw the entire series in quick succession, all, in one go, like Police Academy franchise, 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, whatever it was. And same thing with the Friday the 13th franchise. I may have been late to get on board because I was too young, but when 88 hit, it was just like, saw 6, saw 7, saw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then just constantly watch those films. It was just, Police Academy and, Friday the 13th were just kind of like ran parallel to each other. I was watching one, watching the other. We'd do movie nights, me and my friends. We'd watch the Police Academy films with the Friday the 13th films, and they went well together. Dan says, Mike, can you remember the show called Midnight Caller with Gary Cole? I do remember Midnight Caller. Yeah, I do remember Midnight Caller. Very, very, very fond memories of that TV show. I think it went out about like 9:30 on a Saturday night. 9:30, 10 o'clock. Yeah, I used to really. He was like a DJ. He was a DJ. Was he also like a DJ, also a private detective or something along those lines? But I used to really, yeah, I remember really liking Midnight Caller, and maybe Jamie will probably remember that as well, because it was an American show. I think we're nearly done with the films. Quick mention for Rambo 3. Yeah, 1988 was kind of. I was going to discuss this later on, but I might as well just discuss it now. 88 was kind of like the death knell for like a lot of these franchises in a way. Although they may carry on kicking and screaming until 89. But just looking at some of these films that came out in 88, you got Rambo 3, which obviously this was the end of Rambo for a good 15, maybe 20 years. Poltergeist 3, that was the end of the Poltergeist franchise once and for all. And obviously we get onto the big 3. This is 1988, of course, was only 1 or 2 years in the 80s where. Sorry, Orc says, was that the best thing about 88? It was one of the best things, Orc, definitely. Yeah, I was actually going to mention Die Hard. I was going to mention a few more films later on. Die Hard, definitely. Obviously, Die Hard, Die Hard, Die Hard. Die Hard. Die Hard is kind of. I'll talk about Die Hard now. I'll come back to what I was going to talk about in a minute because I was going to talk about Die Hard. Die Hard it's the most 90s, 80s films I've ever seen. For me, Die Hard is like a movie that should have been released in 1990, 1991. It feels like such a 90s movie, but was released in the 80s. I was like surprised, and even though I've seen the film multiple times, and I know it's an 80s film, I always kind of had to do a double take and think, yeah, it's an 80s film. It just, for me, Die Hard is, it just feels like a 90s movie to me. It kind of feels like one of those 90s balls to the wall action movies that we got a lot of in the early 90s. But yeah, yeah, Die Hard's just a great movie. Bruce Willis's. It's Bruce Willis doing what he does best. I know he has ventured out into doing other stuff, but I personally think you can't top Bruce Willis doing as John McClane. It's that is Bruce Willis for me. Yeah, Chucky was born in 1988. I was gonna mention Child's Play in a little bit. Just going back, but I will just want to go back to what I was talking about with regarding 1988. So this is one of only 2 years in the 80s where we had a Michael, Jason, and Freddy film. 89 was the only other year. It's partly down to the fact that Freddy only came about in 84, and Michael had this big hiatus throughout most of the 80s from 81 till 88. But 88 was kind of like the beginning and the end for these franchises temporarily. Obviously 89, they all came back in 89 as well, which is just like crazy. 89 really was the final nail in the coffin for them in the short term anyway. But yeah, 88, if you were a fan of your big slasher villains, and you were spoiled for choice because obviously you did have Chucky made his debut in 88, and obviously you had the big three. Michael obviously making his big long-awaited return in Halloween 4 in one of the franchise's best movies. But then obviously you got Freddy in Dream Master, which was, I think most people would agree, that is probably maybe the 4th best film. I think majority of people would put the first 3 ahead of it. And obviously New Blood, Friday the 13th, Jason takes on Carrie. Basically, that's kind of what this film was. And I love New Blood. The one thing about the thing about New Blood and Jason Takes Manhattan, which is like, even though they're 2 of the weaker Friday films, is Jason starts off at the bottom of the lake, and I just think that is the perfect beginning for a Friday the 13th film. Jason at the bottom of the lake, for me, is just the way every Friday the 13th film should start. Maybe not every one, but you don't want to get repetitive. But I just think that's the perfect beginning for a Friday film. Is Jason at the bottom of the lake, and so okay, they're not the 2 greatest Friday films, but just in terms of the beginning of the film, it's just such a good start to a film, and he's the bottom of the lake. And as I say, late 80s, adore it, adore the setting, adore the, just reminiscing about the late 80s, man, and just watching, because obviously New Blood came out in 88, so it was the first Friday the 13th film, one of the first Friday films I watched, but watching it like almost like brand new. I think I might have watched it maybe in '89. It would have been '89 when I actually saw it first time, but it was still a brand new film. Probably it was. I think it got an '88 cinema release, and then you have that delay going into like bringing it on VHS. But just watching it around at a friend's house, just my God, so good. And my friend, he had Sky, Sky TV had just come into play in the UK, which is like it was like cable TV. So anybody in the UK knows what Sky TV is. This is going on to another. I'm going on to another tangent now, so I'll just completely go off. So I'm going to start another story now about life in 1988 / 1989. So you guys in the US, obviously, you had probably a lot more channels than we did in the mid to late 80s. So very late 80s, we finally got cable TV. It's called Sky TV. Satellite dish on the side of your house. We get all these new channels which you've never had before. We get The Simpsons, which obviously was just starting to air in the US. And we get all these new shows, like all this new stuff we'd never seen before. And we get we get like WWF wrestling. And this may have been 18. This could have been 1990, but who cares? I'll just go forward a couple of years from 88 to 1990. But yeah, the introduction of like the WWF wrestling to the UK was massive. I can't tell you how big an impact that was on the UK. Anybody who was a wrestling fan back in the day in the US, you probably took it for granted. But growing up in the UK up until the very late 80s, we had like big fat sweaty 40-stone men who were out of shape, who were like 50 years old, just wrestling each other, and there'd be grannies watching it at just with the handbags, and it wasn't very sexy, it was a bit shit. And then we got introduced in like must have been like late 89, early 1990 to like this new WWF, World Wrestling Federation, and you got like Hulk Hogan, who we were mildly aware of through the films he'd released up to that point. But and then Ultimate Warrior, and the Undertaker came along, and it was like, Jesus Christ, these guys are like fucking ripped. They got six packs, they got bronze skin, and they got long hair, and he's cool as fuck. And it was just like, this is just like fucking another world. This is amazing. And the UK got just became obsessed with WWF. Back in the early 90s, oh my God, it was just crazy. I mean, 1992 SummerSlam, Wembley Stadium, 80,000 people, which is probably bigger than almost any attendance in any American stadium up until then, even since. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we were just on board for that. My God. And the thing was at the beginning as well, because it was new and we didn't really know what. I mean, I kind of was vaguely aware that like British wrestling was like fake and staged. I wasn't sure about this new WWF wrestling, because people had said it was real, and because I was a kid, when you're 12, you're impressionable, you don't really know what to believe, and people were saying, no, this is real, this wrestling's real, they actually hit each other and they get injured, and I was like, really, it's real? So I just watched a couple of like episodes of like I think it was like Superstars of Wrestling or Wrestling Challenge or whatever it was, and it took me about half an hour, and I was like, nah, this is fake as hell. This is not real. But it didn't detract from like just the entertainment. I was stumped. I mean, I fell in love with it, and I was like a big wrestling fan right throughout the 90s. I loved the WWF, and to a certain extent WCW towards the end of the 90s when obviously the NWO formed. But yeah, it was just funny, like it's when you're in school and like the way Chinese whispers form, and people say it's like it's real, and you believe them, and then you see Papa Shango putting a curse on the Ultimate Warrior, and he's throwing up, and you're like, what? No, no, this isn't real. This is this is ridiculous. This isn't true. But but yeah, as I say, yeah. I mean, I was totally on board with it. I loved it. I loved the WWF back in the day. Right, I think, yeah, British Bulldog rep in the UK. Yeah, yeah, he certainly did. Especially when he won the Intercontinental belt in '92 from Bret Hart. Rest in peace, British Bulldog. I became obsessed with WWF for years. Me too. Big Dat and Giant Haystacks. So moving on from films, we're going to start talking about like because that was a good pay per view. Yeah, I mean it was a fantastic pay per view. I mean they pulled out all the stops for that pay per view. I think they had to, because obviously it was going live in London, so obviously the American audience was like 5-6 hours behind. So they really had to like put on a good show, because obviously the Americans. I mean, I don't know what the attendance. I mean, in terms of like the buy rate was in America, because obviously it's not peak time for you guys when that aired. But I just want to move away from movies and wrestling. I want to move on to video games, arcade memories, and video games from '88, because that was a big time for me. Once again, in terms of like growing up, reminiscing about, this is it's primarily this streams and these streams going forward about taking a certain year. It's about pop culture. And pop culture for me is it's video games, it's movies, and it's TV shows, and it's music. But talking about like 1988 and talking about video games, you can't really talk about video games without talking about arcades. We've all seen Stranger Things. We've all reminisce. I think people of a certain vintage, we can all reminisce about going to arcades back as a kid back in the day. I remember back in the '80s. For me, I mean, it could be similar to you guys in the UK. In the '80s, we did have arcades. There was certainly a few in Liverpool, but they were like in the city centre, and they were pretty fucking grimy. I don't mind telling you, they weren't the sort of place where, your average like 10, 11-year-old would go and hang out, because it was just full of like old kids, and they'd be This is smoking indoors, by the way. Obviously back in the day, kids smoking indoors. I think they might have even had like a licensed bar in one of them where you could just drink, if I remember rightly. So a lot of my earliest experiences with the goings of I've actually experienced like arcade machines was like going on holiday or vacation to you guys in the US, and we go to like a caravan park, be it Scotland or Wales or England, and on the caravan park there'd always be like a social club, and there'd be like a bar, where all the adults go and have a drink, and there'd be like a disco and whatnot, and maybe a karaoke. But then there'd always be like somewhere for the kids to go, and there'd be like pool tables, and they'd always have arcade machines, and they would never be I mean, this is going back to like the sort of mid '80s. So this is like going back to like 85, 86, 87 maybe. They'd never be the best arcade machines, but they'd be like Defender and Pac-Man, and they're pretty much like the stuff you see in Stranger Things. But when I went to I distinctly remember going to Scotland, and I think it must have been 1988, because I did do my research about this game, about when it came out. And I went to Scotland in 1988, and we went to Ayr, which is like a town in like southern Scotland. And we went to some sort of random town somewhere. I can't remember where it was, but they had like a pretty decent arcade. Arcades basically. And it's the first time I saw, and I'm going to share my screen because I deliberately saved this because I wanted to, the sheer awe when I saw this machine for the first time, I cannot tell you. So, and I'm sure anybody, no matter which side of the Atlantic you're on, we all remember this game. And yeah, it was this game, and I will share it now. That game, Outrun, the sit-down version of Outrun. My mind was fucking blown when I saw this game for the first time, and it's not just the fact that it was a sit-down, like simulation, whatever you want to call it. The graphics, I'd never seen a game with graphics like this before. I could not believe my eyes. It was like it was derived from outer space. It was just unbelievable. I just could not get over how good it was. And the gameplay as well, it's just like the gameplay was just off the fucking scale. I sat down in the machine, played the game. I paid whatever, like, I think at the time it was like 30p. It'd be like £2 now. But I just walked away thinking, oh my God, this is the future. And I was like, I was just awestruck. And I think this is probably like the same year that like the likes of Afterburner came out with like the spinning 360, hydraulic machine. Oh my God, it's just looks like Cruising USA Exotic World. Is that a arcade? Is that like an arcade in America? It wasn't. It wasn't. It wasn't an Outrun machine I shared, wasn't it? I did put in Outrun, Outrun, but whether I've shared the wrong thing, I don't know. But of course, says arcades to me were mid to late 90s because I was born this year. They weren't booming like the 80s, but still lines. Yeah, yeah. I mean, same type of thing, but in the 90s. I suppose there was like different versions came out as well. But I mean, in terms of like that machine back in the, I mean that there was queues to get on that machine back in the day. There'd always be someone who's like really good at it as well, and like they'd be like showing off, and you'd be waiting to get on, and they just keep on putting more money in. It's like really annoying. But in terms of like video games from 1988, because like obviously I'm going through like again I don't know how many games came out in that year, but focusing on the games that like meant something to me. So it's like I owned a Commodore 64. So I think a lot of people in the UK owned a Commodore 64. I don't know how much of a thing they were in America at the time. I think Commodore 64s were a thing, but for some reason I always associate the Nintendo, the NES as being more of a big deal in America. Like the NES in the UK was never really a thing. I don't think until the Super NES came out, or the Super Famicom, as they call it, in 91 or 92. I think that's when the NES, like Nintendo, became a big deal in the UK more. And obviously, that's when the Mega Drive came out in the UK in 91 or 92. I can't remember. I think it was either 91 or 92. But I was a Commodore guy, so I was like a Commodore 64 guy. Double Dragon, that was my shit back in the day. And talking about arcade games, that was a game that, like, oh my God, the money that I put into that Double Dragon machine back in the day, silly money, the amount of 10p's, because I was shit at games. I wasn't very good. So I was constantly putting 10p's in, trying to get further and further. And just, I never seemed to get any better at them either. I was just constantly putting money in. But Double Dragon, RoboCop, geez, that machine just was ubiquitous in arcades back in the day as well. Whenever I went on holiday or I was at home and I went into Liverpool into the city centre, Robocop was always just front and center. Just people were just on there. Like I say, that was the sort of machine where there was a queue for. I mean, R-Type, I adored R-Type. Anybody that left to right scrolling video games, left to right shooters. Oh, just that game is just so good. I mean, it's another game where I was just like completely shit at, and I could barely get past the second level. But I would always put money into it. And when I actually did buy it on home computer as well, it's just I don't think I ever did get past the second level. Auntie says Ghouls and Ghosts and Altered Beast, two of my favourite video. Yeah, Ghouls and Ghosts was so fucking tough. I mean, those Ghosts and Goblins and Ghouls and Ghosts, my God, those games were just so hard. I mean, Jesus Christ. I mean, that's the thing. The ruthlessness of video games in the 80s. Like kids now don't know how lucky they've got it with video games. I mean, you do get tough video games. Don't get me wrong, but you go online and there's a guide for everything. You go back to the 80s, go back to the late 80s, early 90s with some of these games. Not only were they ruthlessly tough, but there was nowhere to go to try and find out how to crack something. Especially you take like an adventure game or something like a bit more obscure. I don't mean like a Zelda game, but maybe like one of the more obscure adventure games, like some of the Final Fantasy games, where how are you supposed to know how to crack a certain like task without going online? It's just, and I remember like Nintendo used to have a helpline where you could actually ring up and ask how to get past a certain like level or past a certain part of a game. I mean, that's just goes to show how far we've come in terms of like video games, and oh my God, it's just crazy. And he says R-Type is a classic. It certainly is. Yeah, I adored R-Type. 1988 was, of course, the birth of a certain beat 'em up called Street Fighter. Okay, the sequel is a lot more famous, I suppose, in some ways. That's the game that set it on its trajectory to where it is now. And obviously, without Street Fighter 2, you would never have got the Street Fighter movie. But Street Fighter 1 was a 1988 video game, and it's worth mentioning. It's a footnote in history. It's that, because although the game is barely remembered now, it was the game that obviously was the influence of Street Fighter 2, and we all know where that went. And also, John Madden, the very first John Madden video game was 1988. I remember John Madden going back to Big Crack Rock's in the chat. What's up, Big Crack Rock? A lot of good SNES games came out in 88. Super C, Mega Man 2, Mario 3, RC Pro, Ninja Gaiden, just hide. I didn't know, is Mario 3's 88 as well? Oh, I've got Mario 2 down as 88, but maybe Mario 3 came out as well. I mean, because Mario 2 is not a game that I remember like as being particularly great. I know Mario 2 was kind of like a little bit controversial compared to, it wasn't like the traditional Mario game. But I loved Mario 3. But go back, yeah. So John, they both came. Oh, so they both came out the same year. Like, God, can you imagine that now? Big Crack Rock. Can you imagine like Rockstar dropping 2 GTA games in the same year? That would never happen. Can you imagine Bethesda dropping 2 Elder Scrolls games in the same year? Fucking hell. That was the great thing about video games back in the day. I mean, okay, video games now, we do get some fantastic releases, but sometimes it's just too much. And, a lot of people don't have the time and effort to put into these games. A game like Super Mario 3 or Super Mario 2, whatever, these late 80s platform games, they were big, expansive games, but you could get through them in like a couple of days with a bit of hard effort, and they have replayability. But I mean, my God, I mean, some of these games now, I get bored before it gets to the end, and you know, I do love like Elder Scrolls Skyrim, but I've never completed that game. And every time I've tried to, I just get sidetracked into doing like pointless shit, and then get bored of doing it, and then just like not play for like 6 months. So you know, I'd yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said for like you know games going back in the day. But yeah, John Madden '88 was the first John Madden game, and I used to, even though I didn't have a clue about American football games, I didn't have a clue about American football. I remember like distinctly about 1992, 93. That must have been about 92, 91. American football became quite a big deal in like my school, and it became quite a big deal in the UK. It's kind of started getting a big following. I think it was around the time that the Chicago Bears were like a big deal, and they had some big, massive fat guy called the Refrigerator. I think he became quite famous for some reason. I think he was just a big fat guy. But the Chicago Bears were quite like a big deal at the time, and at that point, I seem to remember that like, American football was getting quite popular in Britain, and we were playing it in school. You know, just in the schoolyard, just like for some reason. And but John Madden, the video game, was like a massive hit, and I think that was partly responsible for why it started becoming popular in the UK. I think it was like it must have been about, I think it was Madden '92 or Madden '91 that kickstarted the whole thing. But yeah, John Madden, man, that was a big deal. Um, Big Crack Cook says that Western version of Mario 2 was a clone called Doki Doki Unite. They thought we were too dumb for the real Mario 2. He says NFL huge in UK now. Mega Man X. So moving away from video games, gonna move into like music for 10 minutes. I have been streaming for 1 hour 15. That's a reasonable amount of time to be streaming. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about like you know the music of '88, and this is not necessarily my personal favourites or you know anything I bought. I did buy some of this stuff, but it's more about a case of like what I remember of being a big thing at the time, be it like just through word of mouth or through friends, and just basically being in school. Because like as I say, '88 was when I started high school, and you just get introduced to like new trends, and you meet new friends, and they're into different stuff, and that was really apparent with music. But in terms of like you know memories of 1988 and in terms of like buying music, I mean, do you remember buying music? Did anybody remember buying music? Remember how great it was, and when you didn't have to, we didn't stream everything. I mean, and now it's convenient, but remember how exciting it was to just go into like into town or wherever you went and just look at vinyl. And this is like before CDs were really a thing. From what I remember, it's a long time ago. I don't remember CDs being a thing at this point. But in terms of like going to the record stores, I'll share this screen because this is one of my local record stores, and it's quite reflective of my username. But yeah, this is one of my local record stores when I was growing up. Um, if I can share this, share screen. Yeah, so there we go. Yeah, so in relation to Beatles, this is Penny Lane Records, and this is actually on the Penny Lane in Liverpool. Um, Obviously made famous by the Beatles song, which I am named after on my username. But this was one of two stores. There was Penny Lane Records on Penny Lane itself. This is a suburb of Liverpool called Mossley Hill. But there was also a Penny Lane Records in Liverpool city centre on Bold Street, which is where I used to go more frequently. And this is a shop that we used to go to, me and a couple of friends from school, and they were like heavily into like you know heavy metal at this point. And I was never like, I didn't have any idea about heavy metal music at this point. I was completely naive. Um, but they got me into like, you know, Metallica and like Slayer. I mean, I don't purport to be like a fan of these bands now, but like back in the day, I was kind of like used to listen. They just lend me their albums. It was like Megadeth, Slayer, Halloween, Bolt Thrower, Metallica, obviously. You know, all this like sort of like heavy metal slash thrash metal. And it was just so, because it was kind of like intertwined with the whole like slasher genre, you know, because there was kind of like a crossover between these bands, and you know, like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. It certainly felt like it. Like the whole the community of people who were into like all this music were like also really into like slasher films, and it was just such a real good crossover. And yeah, I mean, it was just a really, really good time to be alive at that point, because you know, getting into slasher films at that point and then discovering all these like new like sort of like heavy metal bands, and the artwork as well. The artwork was so fucking insane on them. The artwork was so influenced by horror as well, if you know what I mean. If you look at some of like the artwork on some of these albums, it felt very, very reminiscent to like a lot of the horror stuff going on at the time. But I mean, I just fucking, yeah. I mean, going to like a record store back in the late 80s and just not necessarily buying anything, just holding the vinyl and looking at the artwork and the sleeve and the lyrics and stuff. And because it was like everything that got played on the radio was kind of like safe and like, you know, censored, and a lot of heavy metal stuff. Like, but if it had like swear, I mean, it's totally normal now for like a pop star to swear in the songs. Back in the late 80s, you didn't really hear swear words in songs. It was very sort of like clean and sanitized. But like the heavy metal stuff and Guns N' Roses and whatnot, which I'll get to in a minute, they did swear, and so it was kind of like a big deal. It was like it felt dangerous, and so it just felt like edgy, and it's something that you'd want to be into as a kid. Whereas like now, it's like they try too hard to shock. You know, you got like Cardi fucking B and whatever, Megan Thee Stallion talking about fucking gushing pussies and shit. So it's like it's pretty hard to shock now, because you've basically gone as far as you can. But back in the 80s, it was kind of still, you know, a bit like, you know, a little bit edgy. But in terms of like, I was albums, you know, I'm talking about, you know, experience and going buying music, but in terms of albums from '88, I mean, I think somebody mentioned before, it might have been you, I can't remember, it was Orc or Metallica and Justice for All. Yeah, certainly that was that was on repeat for me. I don't ask me to name I think it was one on And Justice for All, or it might be really naive. One, I remember loving that track. But I'm not like the big. I don't pretend to be the biggest Metallica fan. I'm not. As I say, I just these are albums I listened to a lot back in the day and haven't revisited for years in most cases. But certainly some iconic albums in '88, like Surfer Rosa by the Pixies. I mean, you know, the output was minimal, but like the impact they had like on like music going forward was massive. Just and Straight Outta Compton by NWA. I mean, an album again, like growing up, it's just like seems so it's like such a dangerous album, you know, so edgy, so raw, and something that you couldn't play like in front of your parents. But I mean, but and Lies from Guns N' Roses came out on this year as well. I mean, but I am going to talk about Appetite for Destruction, because even though it's an '87 album, I think it's more. It had a bigger impact for me, and maybe in the UK in '88. But just mention a couple of like really cheesy pop albums. Hanging Tough by New Kids on the Block. I mean, New Kids on the Block were like, they were just enormous for like 12 months. They just seemed to like blow up and then just disappear. It's certainly, from my perspective, they were massive, and then they just went away and never came back. And it's just weird. Like, and also, and I don't really want to mention him, but just I've got to give him a shout out to Bobby Brown. Don't Be Cruel. 1988, only for the fact that in 1989 he was on the Ghostbusters 2 soundtrack, and I really like that song On Our Own. And it's a cheesy song, but and I think Bobby Brown's a fucking prick, but I do like that. I do like that song off the Ghostbusters 2 soundtrack. Darren mentioned South of Heaven by Slayer. Yeah, I mean, I'm not the biggest expert on Slayer. I mean, they are a massive part of 80s heavy metal or thrash metal. I know that. Drink up, shooting, let the beat begin. Harvest for sorrow. Oh, that's a quote, is it? Oh, yeah. As I say, I'm just like, I'm reminiscing now about stuff like I haven't listened to for a long time, but so yeah, like say, like heavy metal was never really my thing. I kind of just got like swept up into it in the late 80s, early 90s, and then just kind of like, as I kind of like left school, went to college, I got sucked up into the whole. I just became like a big fan of Britpop and more like post rock and stuff like that. But yeah, but I mean, but we'll talk about Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses, because that album did really sort of like mean a lot to me back in the day. And obviously that album came out in 87, but 88 was the year when, I think 88 was when it impacted the UK. I mean, Guns N' Roses was just a big deal all over the world. And in the UK, they were just huge. I mean, the fact that they were like they were kind of like, that sort of boogeyman sort of band where it's like, oh, they're dangerous and they swear and they do this. It's the Beastie Boys were kind of similar as well at the time. The Beastie Boys, who were like later years, were kind of like, you wouldn't think that of them. They were kind of like considered dangerous back in the late 80s as well, certainly in the UK. But yeah, Guns N' Roses were just, I mean, that was my shit. I mean, that was like that melodic sort of like hard rock or whatever you want to call it. I mean, that album was just, I just adored that album growing up. I mean, I just thought it was just, it is literally an album where there's not a bad song on the album. Sweet Child of Mine has been played to death, so yeah, I don't like that song now because it's just been played to death, but it's still a great song. But I mean, think about You, Rocky Queen, Mr. Brownstone. Every fucking song on that album, man, it's just a stone cold classic. And I mean, Lies wasn't, it didn't really hit the same. But I mean, I think they came back strong with Use Your Illusion. I think I love Use Your Illusion. I mean, 1 and 2, and the fact that I always associate Use Your Illusion with Terminator 2 because You Could Be Mine in that film, and I just that's another story. That'd be a story for 1991. But yeah, Guns N' Roses, massive deal to me back in the day. Adore them. Dan says, Appetite's still one of the best albums of all time. It certainly is. It's one of the best-selling albums of all time as well. I think that's like probably in the top 10 best-selling albums of all time. I'm just going to wrap things up in the next 10 or 15 minutes. But just a few more films to discuss. Certainly, we're talking Die Hard. Die Hard, obviously, stone cold classic from '88. They Live, not one of Carpenter's best in my opinion, but I know a lot of people love They Live. But I think this is kind of, we're getting diminishing returns from Carpenter. I think this is kind of, Carpenter's just on the downside, on the downward slide now. I mean, I think after They Live, he did In the Mouth of Madness, and then after that, it really does take a big slide. So I think we've seen the best of Carpenter after this. I mean, I think Prince of Darkness was his last great film, in my opinion. I was never a big, massive fan of They Live. Child's Play, obviously, 88, the beginning of, I mean, let's face it, I mean, Chucky's now been around for 30 34 years. So he's a veteran now, and he's been around almost as long as Freddy, which is it's hard to believe really, because I always associate Chucky's. I always think I always associate Chucky as being more of a 90s character, but yeah, I mean 88 was his debut, so he is like an 80s, you know, icon, but yeah, definitely more associated with the 90s than the 80s. I mean, certainly more than the big three. Obviously, I mentioned the Blob. The Vanishing from '88 came out this year. One of the best, suspense movies of all time. I think it's a German movie. If anybody's not seen The Vanishing, it was remade in the late '90s with Jeff Bridges. Watch this version. This version's far better. It's not the Bridges version isn't terrible, but this version is just the German version is so good. Phantom 2, I got a sequel in 1988. Never a massive fan of the Phantom series. I don't mind the first film. Phantom 2 is a lesser film than the first one, in my opinion. So I was never a massive fan, but it's worth noting it is an 88 movie, and it does have a lot of fans. 976 Evil, which is a film I thought I really wouldn't like, and it's Robert Englund's directorial debut. It's actually a fairly decent movie. I mean, it's better than it has any right to be. But yeah, I mean, I actually thought this was going to be absolutely horrendous, but I actually quite enjoyed it. That's about it, really, guys. I mean, I think I've covered. I mean, obviously, 1 hour 30 minutes is not a definitive coverage of everything from the movie, video game, and music, pop culture of 1988. But I think I've covered most of the bases I wanted to cover. But yeah, basically that's it. I mean, this is going to be like a monthly thing, so probably next Tuesday it'll be back to like just covering like the main horror news and this, that, and the other. Like do another like tier ranking video maybe in a week or two. But I'll probably I'll do another. I'll probably maybe something from the early to mid 90s next time. If anybody's got any ideas, just please leave a comment underneath in the actual video, in the actual comment section. And if you haven't left a like on the video, please leave a like. It's a big help. But anyway, thanks to everyone who's been in the chat. Darren, as always, nice to see you on board. Orc, cheers, man. Jamie, Sean, Anthony, Big Crack Rock. I think that's everybody. I said Jamie, yeah. And Steak Sauce, sorry. Steak Sauce was there as well. Anyway, and that's it, guys. So thank you for being on board tonight. And I hope to see you in the next video.